Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll check that your cell phones have been turned off. It will be appreciated as we prepare to begin. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Lisa Curtis, Senior Research Fellow for South Asia in our Asian Studies Center. She focuses on America's economic, security, and political relationships with Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and other nations of South Asia. Before joining Heritage, she was professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, handling the South Asia portfolio for then committee chairman Richard Lugar of Indiana. From 2001 to 3, she served as senior advisor in the State Department South Asia Bureau, where she counseled the Assistant Secretary on India-Pakistan relations. She's also served at the Central Intelligence Agency as a political analyst. She served as a political officer to the embassies in Islamabad and New Delhi from 1994 to 98. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Curtis. Lisa?
Thank you, John, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I'm simply honored to be hosting a book launch for Dr. Christine Fair's just released book, Fighting to the End, The Pakistan Army's Way of War. I think it's an exceptional piece of research, and she has showed tremendous courage in moving forward with her study, saying things that many Pakistan experts know to be true, but that are hard pills for others to swallow. Chris's book is important because it defines in a very methodical fashion the strategic ideological culture of the Pakistan military, and she debunks the myth that Pakistan needs Kashmir resolved in order to feel secure in South Asia. While I'm not saying the situation in Kashmir is perfect, there are clearly still problems that India needs to deal with, but it has become evident that Pakistan's policy of supporting proxy militants to cause problems there has run its course. Pakistan's support for militancy as a tool to achieve strategic objectives has caused problems for all of us. It has contributed to the spawning and growth of al-Qaeda, the ongoing instability in Afghanistan, and the 2008 Mumbai attacks that many feared would lead to military escalation between nuclear-armed India and Pakistan. The argument is not that the Pakistan military is solely responsible for all of these crises, but it is to say that without the role of the Pakistan military and intelligence services in fostering Islamist militancy, the problems would likely not be as intractable as they are today. Now, I also wish to acknowledge the thousands of Pakistanis who have lost their lives to terrorist attacks in the last decade, particularly since 2007, when the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan came on the scene. And I also note that the Pakistan military is engaged in a major offensive in North Waziristan against the TTP right now as we meet. And as I noted in a blog last week, Washington should pull out all stops to bolster Pakistan in its fight against the TTP. But Pakistan must also recognize that it will not fully get a handle on this threat until it works to undermine the ideology that drives all militancy in the region, and that only a comprehensive and consistent policy against terrorism and the ideology that drives it will prevent Pakistan from succumbing to these violent groups. And I just want to say a few words about the importance of focusing on the Pakistani victims of terrorism. I know the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad is promoting a documentary called Karwa Sach, or Bitter Truth, that focuses on the victims of terrorism. And I simply want to say that Pakistan should not allow the terrorists to have the last word. Instead, Pakistanis need to talk about the loved ones they have lost to terrorism and what their lives stood for in order to undermine the messages and ideology that the terrorists seek to spread. So let me introduce our honored guest, Dr. Christine Fair. Dr. Fair is currently an assistant professor at Georgetown. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2004 and an MA from the Harris School of Public Policy in 1997. Prior to joining the Security Studies program at Georgetown, she served as a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation, as a political officer to the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul, and as a senior research associate in USIP's United States Institute of Peace's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She has authored, co-authored, and co-edited several books, the most recent of which is Cops as Counterinsurgents, Policing Insurgencies, which was edited with Shumeet Ganguly. She serves on the editorial board of several organizations and is a senior fellow with the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. So obviously she has a great deal of experience on these issues, but perhaps most importantly, she hails from my same hometown of Fort Wayne, Indiana. So I'm very proud and honored to have my friend and colleague speaking here at Heritage today. Chris, please.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. What she didn't tell you, we went to a rival high school. So she went to a high school where like students had cars, and I went to the high school where we had our cars on cinder blocks in our yard. So that's a really important distinction. So thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank to Heritage for having me. I want to point out the cover work actually on the book. Saira Wasim is this amazing artist, and most of her work speaks to civil military issues in Pakistan. Her art is very critical of the reliance of the military upon what they would call their strategic assets, what we would call the terrorist groups that are menacing the region and Pakistan itself. I also want to point out that when Oxford University Press in Pakistan decided to bring out its version of this book, they had to take the cover off because they said it offended the Pakistan Army. In addition, when they were doing the production of this book, they also wanted to change the maps because they said that the maps in my book, which actually are comporting with the maps that scholars use, did not ascribe to Pakistan's imagined boundaries in the region. So I was really quite floored that an ostensible academic press with ties to Oxford University Press, not Ampara, wanted to change the maps in this book. So obviously I protested. So in the Pakistan version, they'll print the maps, but they're going to have a disclosure saying that this does not comport with our fantasy land. And I'm quite happy with that as an outcome, quite frankly. So here's my question. I mean, for those of us that have been studying Pakistan, I see Steve Cohen is here. He's been studying Pakistan since before I think I was even a gamete in my mother's ovaries. That was clean. It was biological. But I think for many of us that wrestle with Pakistan, it's one of the enduring questions is, why does it do what it does? When at first blush, it doesn't seem as if this is a winning strategy. So after all, it started and it failed to win 3 wars over Kashmir in 47, 48, 65, and 1999. It lost half of its territory to India in its war in 1971, as well as half of its population. And the strategy of coercion, which I'm going to call jihad under the nuclear umbrella, and of course, it didn't have the nuclear umbrella in 47, but it began the strategy of using Islamist proxies in 1947, and as we go into the 80s, it begins developing this concept of a nuclear umbrella. This has really backfired since at least 2002. It's absolutely true, as Lisa said, that thousands, if not tens of thousands of Pakistanis have died due to the TTP, but it's also true that there would be no TTP if there were no Jaish-e-Mohammed, if there had been no Harkat al-Jihad Islami. So what Pakistan's experiencing is blowback. What's actually interesting is it's taken this long for Pakistan to experience the kind of blowback that other countries begin to experience much earlier when they're using these sorts of proxies. So political scientists, and I'm not one of them in full disclosure, my PhD's on political novels of Punjabis, but when I study the literature of political scientists, they find it interesting that a state should persist with a strategy when in fact that strategy endangers the very viability of the state itself. Yet when I look at the data sources I'm going to describe in a minute, I find that Pakistan, not only is it persistently revisionist on this issue of Kashmir, but starting in the 70s, Pakistan articulates for itself a goal that even India hasn't articulated, and that is it sees India as a rising hegemon, and it sees as its primary goal resisting and retarding India's rise. And they begin saying this as early as the 1970s. And they'll say that, in fact, if they're to simply acquiesce to Indian hegemony, that is real defeat. So one of the things that I discern when I come across Pakistan's defense literature is that they don't think of winning and losing, perhaps territorially or even in terms of the number of troops lost or even in the outcome of the battle, but they define genuine loss as being unable and unwilling to get up and counter India again. So you'll even find articles after the 1971 war, which by any definition of loss, they lost. And they actually continued to define themselves as victorious because they were able to once again reassemble themselves despite being taken on by a much larger army and to continue to give India a run for its money. So in some sense, I'm going to argue that Pakistan is like an international insurgent because it has a different goal for itself in terms of what loss and winning means. The conventional wisdom, and I think this animates much of what has been U.S. policy towards Pakistan, is that Pakistan is a security-seeking state. That what Pakistan does is inherently out of insecurity, that it fears India, that if somehow we can figure out what that core insecurity is and satisfy it, Pakistan can be a normal state. It can put down its Islamic proxies. It can be living at peace not only with itself but with its neighbors. And if you look at the 6+ decades of engaging Pakistan, it has involved combinations of money, security assistance, and of course weapon platforms. But I'm going to, and it also gives rise to what I think is a very pernicious line of thinking, that if there could be a border ferry that could come down and solve the Kashmir issue, that Pakistan will be at peace with itself and with its neighbors. And I argue very strenuously against that thinking. I also argue strenuously against the thinking of a grand bargain that Ahmed Rashid, for example, and Barnett Rubin have come up with a number of years ago, that solving Kashmir is the necessary and insufficient for solving Afghanistan. And I elaborate upon this in my book. By the way, this also assumes that Pakistan's claims on Kashmir are legitimate, and they simply aren't for reasons that I noted. There's a UN Security Council resolution which India brought to the UN because Pakistan sent armed militants into Kashmir. The entire conflict that begat the UN Security Council resolution started because of Pakistan's use of militants, and we know from Shuja Nawaz's book that this was not truly a non-state misadventure, as Pakistanis like to say. So I argue that understanding Pakistan as a security-seeking state motivates these U.S. policies of appeasement through military alliance, conventional military assistance, economic assistance, and so forth. Instead, what I argue, and this is actually drawing from the work of Charlie Glazer when he was at the University of Chicago and before he defected to one of the other competitive institutions in this fine city, is that it's not a security-seeking state, that it's actually an ideological state. And it's the quotes there, but he defines an ideological state as a state that's fundamentally dissatisfied with the status quo, desiring additional territory even when it's not required for security. Now, some of you may say, wait, how about those waters up there in Kashmir? Well, that might be an interesting argument to make, but the Pakistanis don't make it. There was a couple of times when Kiani came here, and he echoed that, but I argue in the book that he actually picked that up from Washington analysts who said, well, gee, water is going to be the next source of conflict. So what the Pakistanis are very good at is sort of listening to what Americans say and then parroting it back. Loads of examples of that. And that greedy states use competition as a primary means to achieve non-security goals. And anyone who reads Pakistani military journals, I ask you, for example, to read Ayub Khan's book, the first army chief and the first military dictator, Friends Not Masters, and he has an entire chapter on the ideology of Pakistan. The non-security goals is that the Pakistan Army ascribes to itself not only the defense of Pakistan's territorial borders, but its ideological borders, and these are inherently rooted to the protection of the two-nation theory. I haven't heard Sharif make it yet, but every army chief has pandered ad nauseum to the two-nation theory. It's just a matter of time before Sharif will do this too. So I'm going to argue that these are really important implications. If Pakistan is in fact a greedy state and not a security-seeking state, then everything that we've done, pretending that it is a security-seeking state, actually encourages Pakistan's worst behavior. And of course, this is the argument that I conclude with in the book. The data is basically, my primary source of data is their own writing. These are books and journals, memoirs that they publish primarily for themselves. They're conversations amongst themselves. They're very hard to get. It's taken me years to put together this library. And at different places, I augment it with a bunch of big data sets that I've also taken great pains to collect. So here are the key findings. I mean, any Monty Python fans in the house? Okay. All right. It's just a flesh wound. Pakistan is the Black Knight, right? He gets his arms cut off. It's just a flesh wound. No, I just cut your other arm off. It's still just a flesh wound. And he's got all his limbs chopped off, and he's hobbling through the forest. Come back and take your ankle biting like a man. So, I mean, Pakistan is that. It's like, I don't know how many times Pakistan has to get beaten up, and it still just pops up right back at it. So, to interject a little bit of levity, but the consequences are really quite serious, because what I argue is that Pakistan persists in this persistent revisionism because of the unique ways in which it defines victory and defeat. So a few takeaways from the 6 decades of literature that I've perused. As I said, the Army sees its primary goals as twofold: defending the ideology as well as the geography of the state. Much of this literature is dedicated to defining India as civilizationally Hindu, and we know that's a problem for a number of reasons, although Modi is the physical embodiment, quite frankly, of much of what Pakistanis have been writing about for decades. And this sort of sets the stage for an irresolvable civilizational conflict between these two countries, which of course the Army requires if it's going to continue to retain this place of primacy. Repeatedly, the Army says that it has to defend the two-nation theory at all costs. And I'm happy to talk about why, in my belief, Pakistan will never get over this terrorism situation domestically until it dispenses with the two-nation theory. Pakistanis may bristle at that, but I'm going to stick to it. The Army also sees as itself resisting India's rise. Oh, by the way, the other reason why the two-nation theory is so important to Pakistan is it is central to Pakistan's claim to Kashmir. There's no legal basis for Pakistan's claim to Kashmir. They claim it based upon the two-nation theory. So if they relax that demand, that ideological demand, then they have really nothing else left to lay claim to Kashmir, and even though the two-nation theory has taken a considerable beating. The primary tools, and again, I'm happy to elaborate, is really alliances, namely China, the United States, Saudi Arabia. Not a lot of information about that, but also increasingly jihad under an expanding nuclear umbrella. So let me, I'm just going to hop to the end because I'm cognizant of the time. So when you do an exercise like this, the last thing you want to do is get caught saying, the past is the best predictor of the future, ergo the Army is going to continue running the show. Now, I'm not a very creative person when it comes to these kinds of exercises. I'm very creative in other domains, but so this is obviously limited by my creativity. But I try to think, what are some of the things that could happen exogenously, i.e. things that are not in Pakistan's control, that might shift the equilibrium and put the Army in a place where it's not in the driver's seat as much as it is. Well, a major confrontation. Okay, I scratched my head at this. Osama bin Laden's caught in Abbottabad, and the checks yet kept coming. There have been a number of important things that Pakistan has done that's been very injurious to U.S. interests, including taking about $30 billion and killing our troops in Afghanistan. This is not a provoked a major confrontation. So I'm at a loss as to what could happen that would make a major confrontation between us. And largely Pakistan skates on this coercive narrative that it's just too dangerous to fail, and therefore it's too dangerous to destroy for us. Natural disasters, I think the flood should lay to rest how Pakistan is incredibly resilient. It's the most stable instability. International partners forging it, I don't even need to finish that sentence. You know how ridiculous it is before I even get to the punctuation mark. I looked at endogenous game changers. Democratic transition, well, this believes that civilians want a different world from that of the Army. The Army's been very good at controlling Pakistan's curriculum, very good at controlling the media, and as I noted in my opening remarks, even the intellectual discourse. This is a point I make in my book. So for there to be a democratic transition with the difference, Democrats have to want something different. Economic shocks, we keep buying them out, so I don't think that's going to happen. But let me very quickly show you some really interesting data, and then I'm going to shut up, because this is all in the world of not sure where this goes. But if you look at this chart, if you can see the slides, up in the upper left-hand corner is what Army officer production looked like in 1972. The places that have color is where officers were coming from. The gray is where no officers were coming from. By the time you get to the lower left, 2006, what you see is that most of Pakistan's districts are producing officers. And whereas the top mostly drew from southern Punjab and parts of what's now KPK, you see them reaching into the Sindh and to Balochistan. Now this is really important, and let me tell you why it's important. We do a lot of survey work, and don't worry about the fine print. This is in a paper on my website, christinefair.net. It was published recently in Security Studies. But what we basically ask is opinions about preferences for Sharia, belief about militarized jihad and who can wage it, civilian control of the military, political preferences of Muslims in occupied Kashmir. The actual questions don't matter as much as the statistical variation. So the first thing that we looked at was Punjabis in the Punjab versus Punjabis beyond the Punjab. And no matter what the metric is, what you find is that just by virtue of, this is kind of a natural experiment, just by virtue of growing up not in the Punjab, your views are remarkably different from those in the Punjab. And I might add, it's in the Punjab where we see most support for jihad as a militarized struggle. So whereas 28% of Punjabis in the Punjab think it's a militarized struggle, Punjabis outside of the Punjab, 12% of them think that. But there's similar differences across all of these metrics. If we then take a look at non-Punjabis in the Punjab versus Punjabis, we actually find is there's a great deal of similarity. So there's something about the Punjab, whether you're Baloch, whether you're a Pashtun or a Muhajir in the Punjab, you think much more like Punjabis in the Punjab than anyone else. And then when we take a look at what happens versus Punjabis or Baloch and Balochistan, let's just pretend that they're not recruiting Baloch and Balochistan. Let's pretend that they're recruiting Punjabis. It doesn't actually matter because in point of fact, the Punjabis in Balochistan look more like Baloch than they do Punjabis in the Punjab. So this raises for me, and I'm not Panglossian because what armies do is they put folks through the sausage grinder and they chew out a sausage. We don't really know what happens to these officers that are getting recruited from Balochistan and Sindh because the army's relaxing standards to get them in. But if the army keeps up at this, it's going to become increasingly difficult for the army to continue churning out the sausage because they're basically bringing into their officer cohort with every year officers who don't share some of these core beliefs of the Punjab. So I'm going to conclude that there's not a lot to be optimistic about this because so much of the Pakistan Army strategic culture that I write about in the book has been remarkably resistant to change. But I think this is potentially a game changer. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I think that was a wonderful synopsis of the book. It was a brief synopsis, though, so I think I would definitely encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. We're selling them out front and read the entire book because she's really just touched on the wealth of knowledge, experience, and research that is in the book. Next, we are going to have two commentators, two distinguished, experienced experts on the region. First will be David Sedney. David was formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia from 2009 to 2013. He was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia from 2007 to 2009. He served as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing from 2004 to 2007. And from 2003 to 2004, he was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, where he also acted as charge d'affaires for a few months in 2003. He is a graduate of Princeton University and Suffolk University School of Law. He has received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service, the Department of State's Superior Honor Award 6 times. It's quite an accomplishment. And the Department of State's Meritorious Honor Award twice. He attended Louisiana State University School of Law, and he's a distinguished graduate of the National War College. Second will be Michael Waltz. Michael is currently the president of Metis Solutions, which provides corporate leadership and strategic vision for a defense contracting firm that provides strategic analysis, policy development, intelligence support, and foreign and commercial development to the U.S. government and corporate customers worldwide. Prior to joining the private sector, Mike served as Vice President Cheney's Special Advisor for South Asia and Counterterrorism. His work in the Office of the Vice President culminated with Mike representing the office during President Bush's strategic review of U.S. policy towards Afghanistan and Pakistan, where he advocated for realigning command and control increasing resources, and modifying our counterterrorism posture in the region. Mike also has a military background. In fact, he commanded a number of Special Operation Forces teams in 4 provinces along the border region with Pakistan. He is also a senior national security fellow at the New America Foundation and regularly provides expert commentary on counterterrorism and regional issues for several news outlets. He also founded the Sumar Gul Foundation, which cares for the families of fallen Afghan National Army soldiers. And if that's not enough, Mike is also the author of a forthcoming book, Warrior Diplomat, A Green Beret's Battles from Washington to Afghanistan. He is a distinguished military graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. So please welcome the comments from my guest speakers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Thanks to Heritage for putting this on, but a special thanks go to Professor Christine Fair for producing what I think is really a remarkable blend of scholarship analysis that, well, I can't speak for the academic community because I'm not an academic, but for practitioners, I think it's the kind of book that really deserves to be read. And I say that knowing full well that practitioners hardly ever read books. They hardly ever read articles. They hardly ever take any advice, but they should. They should read this book. They should pay attention to Christine's advice, and let me tell you why. But first, let me say, you can get this on Nook as I did, but the hardcover is better. So get the hardcover. It's outside. Little plug for you. But this book follows on 2 other, I think, remarkable books on Pakistan that have come out in the last 6 months. One by a journalist and one by a practitioner. The journalist, Carlotta Gall's book, is ostensibly about Afghanistan, but the title is The Wrong Enemy. And it doesn't take long to figure out that while the book says Afghanistan on the front, her title, The Wrong Enemy, is not talking about Afghanistan. It's talking about Pakistan. Secondly, Pakistan's former ambassador to the United States, Hussein Haqqani, published a book, I guess at the end of last year, called Magnificent Delusions, which describes U.S.-Pakistan relations, but even more importantly, describes the delusions inside Pakistan that Ambassador Haqqani believes needs to be addressed and lays out in his book. And I would add Dr. Fair's book to this, not because they're academic books, they're not, but because this book, along with the other 2, point to the huge challenges that Pakistan continues to bring for the United States and will continue to bring in the future. At a time when we are paying a huge amount of attention to Iraq, a country of about 25 million or so, that does produce a fair amount of oil and is in a strategic area. The country of Pakistan has nearly 180 million people, has nuclear weapons, which Iraq does not, has huge, I would submit, huge structural problems that are in many ways worse than the problems that bedevil Iraq. It's just that Iraq's are more evident right now because of a series of pressures. And if you look ahead to the next 30 to 40 years, dealing with Pakistan is something that we all are going to have to struggle with, practitioners, academics, journalists, and elsewhere. Why do I find this book so important? In many ways, it's the way Chris uses this point of strategic culture to describe the way that Pakistani army, Pakistani society, Pakistani culture act and behave. One of the distinguishing features during my time dealing with Pakistan in the United States government was the conviction of many people that the most important thing in dealing with Pakistan was personal relationships. Building up of personal relationships, particularly by individuals at high levels, was the key to changing Pakistan. Another book that I'll mention, and was written by a former U.S. government colleague, Vali Nasser, The Dispensable Nation. In the beginning, when he describes what he and Ambassador Holbrooke were working on, they talk about their desire to change Pakistan, to change Pakistan's strategic calculus, and to do so through a variety of means, including personal interactions. with the insights that Dr. Fair puts out about the enduring nature, the breadth and depth of the strategic culture that underlies the way Pakistan and the Pakistani military behaves, I think it makes clear why we continue to fail in these efforts. I think broadly speaking, the administration that I served in believed after 2 years of great efforts to produce a strategic partnership that would change Pakistan's strategic calculus, that it had failed. And whenever there's failure, there's blame. And a lot of that blame is assigned to Pakistan. I think this book actually shows that some of the blame should be assigned to us for not understanding the problem we were trying to address. I think it's, as I said, I think it's a very important book to read and an important way of looking at Pakistan. I don't share every one of Christine's judgments, and she would be surprised if I did. I am not as pessimistic as perhaps her book appears to some. Maybe Christine would not find that a fair characterization. I think that, for example, the election of Prime Minister Modi in India, while it may initially appear as personifying the myth of India, as Chris just mentioned, it also has a possibility through Prime Minister Modi's very strong emphasis on economic reform, his emphasis on changing the sad bureaucratic structures that both Pakistan and India inherited from the British in ways that hold the promise of really unleashing the power of India's economy in ways that I think could impact Pakistan and bring it and India closer together economically. I think that is a kind of pressure that might lead to change in Pakistan, but I'm prepared to be told that I'm wrong. And I think there are other things as well that could impact Pakistan, particularly success in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is having a democratic transition that took Pakistan many decades to have a succession from one civilian leadership to another. At least we hope that's happening, and we'll see if the current tensions are resolved there. The emergence of an Afghanistan with a national army that, while no way can challenge directly Pakistan, is a much bigger security concern for Pakistan than Pakistan's ever had on that border before, is something that I think has potential to change Pakistan. But there are also downsides to all of these. And in any case, those of us who either were policymakers, are policymakers, who will be policymakers, I do think it's really important to understand the points that Dr. Fair makes in her book, and coming up with the right policy paths is only possible if you understand the policy problems. And having sat in many White House meetings and Department of Defense meetings and Department of State meetings where people throw up their hands and say, we don't know what to do about Pakistan. They're always acting against their own interests. Of course, those are the interests that we define, not necessarily Pakistan. Reading this book gives you some understanding of why that might be the case, and gives you some, I think, perspectives on how to move forward. So thank you, because I thought it was a tremendous book. I really hope people read it, and I hope people pay attention to Pakistan now, despite all the focus on other areas. And I hope your book is something that people continue to read for a long, long time. I'm sorry, one caveat. As I read the book, I thought of at least 6 new books that deserve to be written based upon questions that were raised. So I think writing and scholarship about Pakistan definitely is a growth industry. For sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Michael?
Well, thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, David, for stealing a lot of my thunder. So,
It's always great to go first.
Yes, right. Always good to go last. Well, I'll tell you, at least from my perspective, what this book is not, especially for those who haven't purchased it yet or had the chance to read it. It's not a beach book. This is not one you're going to take to the Outer Banks and have a light read. You know, that you're just going to flip through. It's dense. It's packed with scholarship, and I think it's, Chris, Chris, I think this is really going to become one of the seminal books on Pakistan that you should be immensely proud of. When I was the AFPAC director, or I know a lot of folks hate that term. When I was the Afghanistan-Pakistan director in OSD policy, I made everyone that was coming into the shop read Steve Cole's Ghost Wars, which I think is also one of the seminal books on the region. And Chris, I think you're going to be quickly, as folks go through this, added to that list. It's really fantastic. I'll just add a few points, not to repeat a lot of what David said, but I can't underscore enough the point of how much time and effort we've spent from a policy perspective in the last 10 years trying to address Pakistan as Chris describes it, as a security-seeking state. And that if only we could change that calculus, that we could change behaviors and therefore improve our posture and improve our outcomes in the region. What that really devolved to was just how do we change that? How do we change that calculus? And really became, what do we do? The mix of carrots and the mix of sticks along that kind of continuum, but it was always underscored with the security-seeking state. And where I think, at least Chris hammered home to me was the deep-seated and how deeply rooted the Pakistani military's approach to the world is in ideology, is in the partition, and is frankly not going to change by a mix of programs. So how did that play out? It played out in a number of ways from the U.S. policy perspective. In countless strategic dialogues and countless White House meetings and Defense Department meetings, it played out from reimbursing the Pakistani military and for its counterterrorism and counterinsurgency efforts to the tune of billions of dollars. It played out in very focused programs such as the Counterinsurgency Fund, which said, fine, we're not going to buy you things, Pakistan, that you're going to use to address your India problem. We're not going to buy you planes that hunt submarines and tanks and missiles and what have you. We're only going to buy you night vision equipment. We're only going to buy you helicopters, and we're only going to buy you things that you can then use to focus on the Western enemy or focus on the Taliban insurgency versus the Eastern enemy. And this was all in our effort to kind of shift Pakistan's thinking from east to west. And then that kind of evolved to, okay, we need to broaden our relationship beyond a transactional defense-focused relationship, and that evolved into the Nunn-Lugar legislation that, with the premise that if we could invest in the Pakistani civilian sector, then maybe that would then kind of drive its defense sector in a proper direction. So thank you, Chris, for making me realize that all of that was for naught in the last 10 years. I'm joking. But, that's really kind of how a number of those, and, David, please disagree if you think I'm off base here, how that all played out over the last 10 years. So without spending too much time on the policy standpoint, from the policy standpoint, I think what I can bring to the table is also from kind of an on-the-ground perspective, having done multiple tours on the Pakistani border or in Afghanistan. How does that affect kind of our most preeminent policy, kind of initiative in more than initiative, frankly, the war, and the war that we're still in, despite many in this administration, frankly, that want to declare it over, even though it is not. I didn't fully realize the extent of Pakistan's support to the Taliban and how that manifests itself on a day-to-day basis until I actually served on the border. I had done tours in Uruzgan and Helmand and other areas in southern Afghanistan, read the reporting back here in the United States on a day-to-day basis, and felt fully ensconced in the issue. But until I was in Host, Paktika, Paktia, across from Chaman, across from Parachinar, across from Wana, I can't overemphasize that there are daily clashes, there are daily rocket attacks, there is daily collaboration up and down that border from the Pakistani Frontier Corps, from the Pakistani military, and frankly with with our enemies. That is killing American soldiers, has killed American soldiers over the last 10 years, and I would argue has resulted in where we are today in Afghanistan. And I know those are stark terms, but I think they need to, in a what's often kind of a think tank or academic setting, I think we need to realize in very stark terms, the outcomes or how this policy is affecting our military and our soldiers serving on a day-to-day basis. I think I'll stop there and just point out one area where I may somewhat disagree with some of Chris's writing in the book, and that I do share some of David's optimism on the economic front. Whether it is, and unfortunately I don't think it'll be anytime soon, but I do hold out hope that economic transformation in Pakistan, that some type of class change or rise in the middle class, and some type of improvement in their economic situation, whether it's through a TAPI pipeline or an IPI pipeline, or transformation in their energy sector or other sectors, will then put the Army's behaviors in their perpetual war footing, or will at least put the Army into a situation where its perpetual war footing is now adversely impacting that new economic transformation. In my view, that's our only hope, especially if you buy all of Dr. Fair's premises. And I have to have some type of hope. Because this is, this book really says that we're in for the long haul here. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Michael.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor to questions, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. But first, just to build on what Michael was saying about he didn't realize the extent of the Pakistani support to the Afghan Taliban until he served on the border. I remember having a conversation with somebody probably 7 years ago or so, and we were recognizing all the problems that we could see in terms of Pakistan not really helping us in our what we were trying to achieve in Afghanistan. And the other person said, I think things will change once soldiers that have actually been serving in Afghanistan come back to the Pentagon and talk about their experiences on the ground and what they experienced in terms of the support they saw coming from the Pakistanis to the forces that they were fighting. And so I think this has happened. It's taken a long time, but it has happened. So the second point that I wanted to make, and I'll preface this by saying, they say the sign of maturity is the ability to accept a paradox. And I think we are faced with a paradox with the Pakistan military because, frankly, as troublesome as their policies are and as divergent as their strategic interests are from ours in the region, they are all we have to work with in terms of fighting the militants in Pakistan. And as I mentioned, they are fighting the TTP in North Waziristan as we speak. And so it's for that reason that I think it is essential that we remain engaged with the military as an institution. And this is very difficult. I do believe that our aid should be conditioned. Our military aid, not civilian aid, but military aid needs to be conditioned. It is conditioned, but the Obama administration keeps exercising its national security waiver authority to continue that military assistance, which is, the discretion of the executive to do that. But so there really is no easy solution here, but I do believe it's important to keep that engagement going and to support them when they are fighting militants that are also a threat to us. The TTP is clearly a threat to the U.S. as well. But so I guess my question for Chris and the others, if they'd like to comment, is, how do we manage this paradox in our foreign policy and how we approach Pakistan of, on the one hand, not being able to trust the military and knowing they're supporting enemies of the U.S., but at the same time, they're also fighting, at the same time, enemies of the U.S. and enemies, of course, of the Pakistani state.
So, in 2004, I was still at the Bland Corporation, and I was asked to, this was right in advance of the Pakistan Army's now famed South Waziristan offensive. So I went to Pakistan and did the usual poking around. I was in Peshawar, and I'd come across a number of first-hand accounts of the Tochi scouts facilitating Taliban movement. And I came back and I briefed the client, and I won't say who his name is because he would be chagrined. He actually was chagrined. He told me as much several years later, that this was the case. About in 2007, I got a phone call from this very same person who said, I'd like to take you out to lunch. And I said, sure, as long as you're paying. And he said, when you briefed us in February of 2004 about the Tochi scouts facilitating Taliban movement, we thought you were crazy, you had a nose ring, you have salty language. We really didn't take you very seriously. But we now know that you were absolutely right. I went to apologize, and I said, it was your money that you wasted. I get paid. But he wanted to know what we do about it now, because by 2007, we had genuinely realized the extent to which the Pakistanis had been facilitating the Taliban movement. So I think that we kind of have to ask ourselves, how is it that we saw in this arrangement so much what we wanted to see? I think that's a really important thing. And we were having soldiers coming back. When I worked with UNAMA in 2007, it wasn't just the Pakistanis that were facilitating the Taliban. They were also facilitating Lashkar-e-Taiba killing our troops. Lashkar-e-Taiba, FYI, has been killing our troops in Afghanistan since 2004. So it's not just India's problem. So we have to ask ourselves, what was it about our system that we saw in Musharraf, what we wanted to see? I encourage all of you to go back and read his speech that he gave when he was explaining to Pakistanis about why he was going to align with us. Americans saw such optimism in that. Every year I try to go back and reread that speech. If you want it, send me an email and I'll send you the link. And every year I read that speech, I realize just how wrong we had interpreted Musharraf's action. So the first thing I would say, we really need to understand how we got it so wrong in the first place. Second, how do we handle the Army? Well, here's what I don't get. I don't even know where to begin with this, especially at Heritage. I might spontaneously combust. But let's talk about Iran for a second. All right, I'm not terribly cozy with Iran, but I often do this counterfactual in my class on South Asian security. Khatami was incredibly helpful at the beginning of 9/11. They were very helpful with the invasion in Iran. They were incredibly helpful at Bonn. It was Iran that suggested putting democracy in Afghanistan's constitution. It was Iran that emphasized the importance of giving the global war on terrorism and counter-narcotics prime place in the Afghan constitution. Dobbins has talked about this at length, as have other participants at Bonn. What did Iran get for that cooperation, being labeled in the axis of evil? I wrote a cookbook, Cuisines of the Axis of Evil, so I benefited from it. But if we were to go back and think about that opportunity, if we were running this war out of Chabahar and Bandar Abbas using the logistical links that the Indians were building with the Iranians, and we weren't dependent upon the one country that undermined our interests, would we be in a different place? Now, people will say, oh my God, but the Iranians, they support terrorism and they proliferate with nuclear weapons and all of this stuff. Iran aspires to be Pakistan, right? There's not a single thing that Iran has done that Pakistan hasn't done more of. And yet we found a way to shove $30 billion and counting down the Pakistan military machine. So I start with this counterfactual. So what do we do in the real world? I think we really need to be realistic. Iran has more interests in common with the Americans in this region than do the Pakistanis. By the way, the Saudis. I just came back from Saudi there in February. The Pakistanis and the Saudis are on the same page. We have so much more in common with Iran than we do in Pakistan. Thinking about the Pakistan Army, I don't really see any reason why we should be so effusive in supporting their counterterrorism efforts when, in fact, they're doing nothing to stop the production of terrorists, right? So we're basically paying them to mow their own lawn. So I'm going to go even further than Lisa in terms of conditionalities. I want to see. I'm going to suggest conditioning security assistance, because why are we putting our money to basically pay them to kill their terrorists. For everyone they kill, they grow up 10 more. By the way, this is not a madrasa issue. This is a Pakistani public school issue, right? So I'm also going to be, and I can't believe I think I'm the most liberal person here, but I'm going to advocate very significant targeting and prosecutions of ISI personnel, military personnel. If they want to kill Americans in Afghanistan, why are they getting a visa? Why are their kids getting visas? Why aren't we prosecuting them? So I think that we really need to treat Pakistan like the enemy that it is. Now, that might seem very extreme to you, but by the way, this doesn't mean that we don't engage our enemies, right? We engage China, we engage the Soviet Union. But I think we really need to deal with Pakistan as it is. It is a country which fundamentally opposes some of our key and most important interests in the region. It should be treated as such. Says the Democrat.
Okay. All right. Do you guys want to say anything, or should we go to the audience?
I actually would like to comment on that.
Thank you.
Because, first of all, let me reiterate everything nice I said about Chris's book. And then let me follow up by saying I disagree strongly with a number of the points she just made. And I think it goes back to the point that you made, Lisa, about the paradox. I don't disagree with Chris that there are elements of what Pakistan is doing that are, as she described it, mowing his own lawn, paying them to mow their own lawn. However, I think you also have to look at potential for what happens if we change our currently ineffectual policy. So just because you have ineffectual policy doesn't mean that changing it in the ways that Dr. Fair suggested or in the ways other people suggested is going to result in an even better solution. Let me just go back. There was mention of Nan-Lugar. Secretary
Kerry Lugar.
Kerry Lugar.
Lugar.
Sorry, Kerry Lugar. Living at a different thing.
Different time.
Nan-Lugar, Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, in his book, describes how the Kerry Lugar bill, which was proposed as something that would be good for U.S.-Pakistan relations and would be positive, turned out not to be so because of both the kind of conditionality we put into it and the way we handled communicating that conditionality, and became a major problem in our relations. Now, you can agree or disagree that we should have tried to use conditionality, but I think it's hard to disagree that the result of Kerry Lugar was a negative one for both sides. It didn't achieve the goals of conditionality. We've been waiving the various conditions, so we haven't achieved the conditions. We also didn't improve our relationship with the Pakistani military, and we have not really achieved any of the goals that were set out there. So good intentions, poor execution, but also, and this is where I'll go back to Chris's book, because we don't understand the cultural context that we're dealing with. As I said, I very much admire the way that Chris forces the reader to understand that this is not just about one person or one regime or one set of actors in Pakistan. But I also believe that because of not just the potential dangers, but the existing dangers, the existence of what has happened in Pakistan, we can't just say, we can't walk away. And in my view, the kind of conditionality that says do it our way or else is, as it has elsewhere in the world, generally been doomed to failure. I think it would make things even worse. And I think you have a responsibility if you make things worse. You can feel good about saying we're not going to work with you because you've done X, Y, and Z that have resulted in dead Americans. But if doing that means that there are more dead Americans, and by the way, more dead Indians, more dead Pakistanis, more dead Afghans as a result of making things worse, then we can bear the responsibility for that too. I think these are really tough issues. I'm not saying that my views are the only answer, but I think there is a response to both Lisa and Chris's views on sanctions, which is why I was a willing participant in many strategic dialogues with Pakistan, reached out to the Pakistani military. I, of course, have met many highly honorable individuals in the Pakistani military. I admire the sacrifices that the Pakistani military makes for its own country. But I agree with the analysis in Chris's book that it's in pursuit of a misguided strategic culture that makes it currently not possible for us to work together. But I don't believe that we should make the kind of major changes that have been suggested, because I think we would actually end up regretting that more.
I just want you to explain a couple of things. Because first of all, why should it be, this might sound like, explain this like I'm a 3-year-old, like if you're explaining it to your 4-year-old niece.
No, you're not. So I'm not going to do that.
Because this is like, for me, such a fundamental disconnect. Why should the U.S. have the goal of improving relations with the Pakistan Army? Do we have this goal with the Chinese Army in the same way? That somehow that if we just, through providing of money, equipment, and training, that we're just going to be kumbaya with the Chinese
That's never been our
military?
goal, to improve our relations with the Pakistani military.
Well, that's what you said.
That's a tactic.
Okay, but
That's not a goal.
okay, fine. The tactic of improving relations with the Pakistan Army. Do you actually believe? That on a personal-to-person level, they may very much enjoy coming here, taking their wives shopping, bopping, hanging out, having a PBR on the side. But this doesn't change their strategic outlook. That if need be, they will kill our troops in Afghanistan. They will continue to raise Lashkar-e-Taiba. What I am missing is the argumentation of how large sums of money, and let's talk about Kerry, Lugar, Berman. The conditionality and the confusion of that was generated by the ISI. The Pakistan embassy, and when many of us did hearings, the Pak embassy had folks there, they knew full well what the conditionalities were. ISI put together their usual corral of paid media individuals prostituting themselves to the paycheck of the ISI to generate all sorts of misinformation about the nature of the conditionalities. This wasn't, the conditionalities per se were not the problem. The Army didn't like that security assistance was being conditioned. So they created a genuine lie in Pakistan's media about this. This wasn't our fault. This actually, I would argue, that this provides further evidence that I would argue that any effort to neuter the Pakistan Army is going to be resisted by them, and fundamentally, they're going to succeed. So explain to me how engaging the Army with our money and our weapon systems, how does this deter them from continuing to support Lashkar-e-Taiba, to continue to support this whole slew of Deobandi militants because they're useful? I'm not getting this logical connection.
Well, sorry, I'm going to try to answer the question. I can't explain it as you would to a 2-year-old, because actually there are things you can't explain to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 2nd or 3rd grader. And treating relations with another country as if they're one-dimensional, and if they do bad things, we should punish them, and if we punish them, they will then do things better. While it can be satisfying to you individually, the record of that working in not just Pakistan but elsewhere is very poor. The objective, the goal, is not to improve relations with Pakistan. And I want to go back to what I said. I didn't say that the personalization of relationships was the answer. I said the personalization of relationships was a problem, and I'm agreeing with you there. Just to clarify what I said before, I was not advocating the personalization of the relationship. I was saying understanding the factors that you lay out in the book is important to counter the over-personalization and over-dependence on personal relations that I've seen too often, actually not just in Pakistan, but with many other countries.
At every level, President Bush-Musharraf relationship, at every level, it was overemphasized.
You can look into the leader of another country's eyes and trust them, and then see what they actually do. There's a lot of this in history, not just in the United States. Again, not advocating building relationships for relationships' sakes. What I am advocating is what is in the United States' interest. The United States' interest is in not having. We do have a real interest in not having Pakistan use the nuclear weapons that it has. We had a strong interest in Pakistan not having nuclear weapons. The tactics we adopted to that, and I think you lay out the motivations behind the Pakistani acquisition of nuclear weapons, and I think others have too, but I think you laid it out in a particularly clear way. We failed to do that. We tried really hard, including including sanctions, conditionality, and a lot of behind-the-scenes diplomacy, hard talk, tough talk, that kind of thing. But in the end, we failed. So now we have Pakistan that has nuclear weapons. We have Pakistan that, say, on the education side, if you look at the UN Human Development Index, where I think the most recent one from 2012 or 2013 said that the average amount of education that an adult Pakistani has is 4.9 years, which places them somewhere around 170th out of 187 countries surveyed. And contrast that, say, with India or Iran or others of their neighbors that are much higher. This is a country that has huge problems, and just throwing up our hands and saying because they've done bad things we shouldn't work with them, I think is the wrong policy prescription. I don't think we have blindly given money to Pakistan without being aware of the paradoxes that Lisa mentioned. It is very hard to do that. One of the reasons for the Pakistani counterinsurgency fund that Mike Waltz mentioned before was an effort to try and do things differently. That ended up failing, both because of implementation problems on our side here between the Department of State and Department of Defense, but most importantly because Pakistan in the end threw out our special forces trainers and cut off relations, so we couldn't achieve those goals. But it was, in my mind, that was an effort that's worth trying because of the stakes involved with the future of Pakistan and the consequences to the other countries in the world. I apologize for such a long answer. I would love to continue this debate for years, but
it is the fundamental foreign policy debate. But do you have something to add?
Just very quickly, I wanted to address your question, Chris, because it, from my soldiers to our Afghan counterparts to kind of the average taxpayer, why are we allies with Pakistan? Why are we where we are today? And just looking back over the last 10 years, I point to kind of 4 key reasons. One was what both you and David mentioned, was the emphasis and the belief, at least within the Bush administration, that relationships matter. They matter immensely in that part of the world, whether it was Vice President Cheney's relationship with the King of Saudi Arabia, or in this case, President Bush's relationship with Musharraf. 2 was the trade-off that we continue to receive with Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was the focus, and I think the Pakistanis used that to their advantage quite often and quite effectively, and it fit our goals at the time. 3 was the ongoing debate within the intelligence community of really what Pakistan was up to in terms of supporting the Taliban, and why, and how high up into that state, or how high up into the Pakistani state that it went. And so whenever we turned back to the intelligence community, we got kind of a muddled answer, at least until 2008, 2009. Were these retired officers? Were these rogue officers? I mean, we knew it was happening, but the finger kind of going squarely into the chest of the most senior leaders, and this being a matter of state policy, took quite a long time. And then 4, frankly, as we would evolve down to, I think, where you are, Chris, and folks, I would kind of see this phased approach of folks that were dealing at the senior leader on the U.S. side with Pakistan of we need more carrots, to we need a balance of carrots to sticks, to then frustration building and where's my baseball bat, I mean, but by the time we would get there, which the Bush administration, I would argue, was almost there in 2008, we would change out and you kind of start over again. And going down the road of having Pakistan as frankly as an enemy was so dark and so bleak that we would devolve back to, all right, let's try the carrots again. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think we can all agree that U.S. aid to Pakistan has not changed the Pakistan military's policies toward the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Haqqani Network, and the Afghan Taliban. But I think you can make an argument that our assistance or our continued engagement with the Pakistan military does help keep Pakistan's nuclear weapons out of the hands of terrorists, which is clearly a U.S. interest. So with that, I'm going to move to the audience, and I'm going to first take this gentleman here. If you can wait for the microphone, somebody will bring it to you, and if you can state your name and affiliation.
My name is Admiral Puri. I'm retired. I'm on leave. I'm here visiting my son. And there was this discussion, so I thought I would attend. My question is, way back, just after 9/11, we were in a discussion, in a meeting at the highest level here, I was accompanying our defense minister. We made very much the same points as Christian is making. I mean, I personally would totally agree with what her book says. What makes me wonder is, why is Indian advice taken so lightly?
What was the last part of your?
Why was Indian advice on this issue? I remember Jaswant Singh saying in that many words that, look, we consider this like a snake whose head is lying in Pakistan and the tail is wagging in Afghanistan. And we have a folklore in Rajasthan, from where Jaswant Singh came, to say that if you have a snake, first get rid of its head. The tail will look after itself. But, and this has been talked of in many dialogues much before that also. I mean, and we have a history of seeing non-state actors being used as a matter of policy by the Pakistanis. I mean, 47 was a non-state actor attack. But all these non-state actors have been supported by the Pakistani army. Next is the non-state actor attack in 65, started off with that. In 71, of course, it was different. It was their own problem. In Kargil, again, it was non-state actors. So my question is that this has something that we have faced, we have dealt with them. But why is there so much disbelief in any advice that India gives on the subject?
Who would like to take that question? Chris, do you want to?
He should. They were in policy.
Okay.
Well, I was in
David?
policy, and I would actually not agree with you that there is this level of disbelief in India's recommendations. There is not agreement on all of India's recommendations over the time that I've been working on policy, but there is also a lot of effort to listen to Indian suggestions, and I think that certainly over the last 5 years, the efforts by the prior Indian government to both initiate serious dialogue with Pakistan, to open economic ties with Pakistan, and to discuss their respective efforts in Afghanistan. They were not just listened to by the United States, but supported. They were, of course, not fully successful, and there's a lot of work to be done. But I would say, at least from my own experience, I don't see that we do dismiss everything that the Indian government has said. Now, there's lots of commentators and others in India that have different views and stronger views regarding Pakistan, and we certainly haven't paid attention to those in terms of saying that there was no need for Pakistan to exist, those kind of things. But I don't think that's the policy of the Indian government anymore. The Indian government is very clear that they respect the right of the Pakistani state to exist, and they're trying to find ways to work with and improve that. So at least during the period I was involved, I just don't find I don't find that to have been the case.
No, I don't have a lot to add, but just to say that, I think there is a realization of to some degree of what the Indians have been saying and what's in this book. The debate has always been what to do about it. I mean, it's one thing to say cut off the head, but I can tell you the appetite within at least the administration with which I worked of having another enemy on top of our difficulties with Iraq, on top of our difficulties with Afghanistan, and wrapping our mind around cutting off the head, so to speak, or having an enemy now in Pakistan as well was just too much to bear. So we've reverted back to carrots to try to change the snake's behavior, to use your analogy. So
there was also a lot of drone strikes against that snake's head.
Yeah,
I might add.
Right. Well, and again, that was a different. Is Al Qaeda in our interest or the state actors that Pakistan was supporting in our interest?
Okay, I want to call on this gentleman right here.
You want to give me Thank you. My name is Hitisham, and I'm a Fulbright scholar here in the United States. Of course, I haven't read the book, but my observations are based on the presentation made by Christine. Unfortunately, I found some of there is a lot to debate about, but I understand I am a participant only, I can make only use of limited time. I found some of the arguments were very selectively used, and only one side of the picture was presented. For example, a couple of examples. You said Kashmir, Pakistan has no legal basis on Kashmir. I don't understand what sort of legal basis should we have. You have mentioned about the UN resolution. You have mentioned that India went to a Security Council, and Security Council said that let the Kashmiris decide. Let us have a plebiscite there. So that's a legal basis. Go and ask the Kashmiris with whom they want to go. My second observation, yes, we had a beautiful lawn back there in our homeland, but it was late 1970s, at the peak of Cold War. Soviet Union just entered Afghanistan, and here was the CIA and the Americans. They went to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and fortunately, incidentally, they found an ally in the form of ISI or whatever, and they jointly created this jihad narrative. Kashmir is not the only thing which is behind those groups which you are calling the jihadis and terrorists. In fact, Kashmir has always been there. The rise of jihadis has been after the Soviet Union entered, and then CIA went there and worked with ISI, and the jihad narrative was brought, groups were made and fought with, and then the Soviets were pushed out. And then US left Pakistan and Afghanistan in the lurch, and Afghanistan fell into the hands of the warlords.
All right, so you need to read my book, because every single thing that you just said is fictional. Let's first begin with the UN Security Council Resolution 48. Sir, have you read it? Have you read?
No.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to encourage you to do is go on to the UN Security Council's website and read that fabulous resolution that every Pakistani points to, but which not a single one has read. I also then want you to take the actual version from the UN Security Council, and then I want you to compare that to the claims made by Pakistan's permanent representation to the UN. And you're going to understand your confusion, sir. So the resolution is actually very clear. There are 3 steps. They were sequential and they were conditional. The very first step was that Pakistan was supposed to demilitarize to the satisfaction of this UN body that was to be established. Then, conditional upon the UN being so satisfied with this demilitarization, India was also supposed to demilitarize with a presence being permitted to defend itself against Pakistani aggression. The third, having both of those 2 steps taken place to the satisfaction in sequence to this preferences of the UN, then the plebiscite would be held. So all those Pakistanis that are so upset about the plebiscite that never happened, they have their own government to blame, because Pakistan never fulfilled the first necessary but insufficient condition. So I'm going to encourage you to actually read that before you ever make such a fool of yourself again by presenting it in public, right? So just do yourself a favor by reading the darn thing. Second, I want you to also learn a little bit about your country's Afghanistan policy. Sir, do you know that it was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto that began the ISI cell in Afghanistan? That in fact it was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who began setting up what became the 7 donkeys before the Soviet Union even crossed the Amu Darya. Did you know this, sir? No, I want you to answer my question. Did you know this, sir?
No.
Okay, so this idea that somehow the United States used Pakistan in some sort of some sort of effort to dispel the Soviets is completely an incorrect reading of your own history. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, after King Zahir Shah was ousted, and Daud came to power and began implementing pro-Soviet policies, driving the Islamists into Iran and Pakistan respectively, Zulfikar set up an ISI cell so that he could then use those disenchanted, disenfranchised Islamists to become vectors of Pakistan's policy in Afghanistan. Did you know that we first sanctioned Pakistan in April of 1979 because of advances made in its nuclear weapons program? If we were so interested in sucking them into our evil jihad designs, we sure did make that difficult for ourselves, because when the Soviets did finally cross in, we actually had to do a bunch of maneuvering to get a waiver. And did you know that the first monies did not go into Pakistan until 1982 because of that requirement to get a waiver? So before you go and you blame the United States for using and abusing poor Pakistan, you should familiarize yourself with your own history, because in fact Pakistan had been instrumentalizing Islamists long before the Americans even knew what an Islamist was. Now, going to your next point about the Americans just leaving Pakistan high and dry. Well, this comes to, and Steve Cohen is here. I'd like to hear him talk about this. Let's talk about the Pressler Amendment, right? The Pressler Amendment was actually designed so that Pakistan could continue proliferating while we continued arming you, right? Because we'd first sanctioned you in April '79. Everyone understood the name of this game. When we withdrew in 1990, we withdrew. Pakistan, however, continued mucking around with the Islamists. So this idea that the jihad today are the Taliban of today and al-Qaeda, this is also a really grotesque and empirical error that I don't quite frankly expect from a Fulbright student. So I'm happy to have more exchanges with you, but I think you should read my book because everything that you said is a highly stylized retelling that you get from Pakistani media in your curriculum.
Okay, David, I think you wanted to make a comment.
I will respond because I have read your book very carefully and I admire it. But I will have to distinguish myself from your remarks because I do find some of what the gentleman said to be worthy of consideration. And I would add that that's not just me. Someone who I worked for and have huge respect for, and I commend his book. I'm commending a lot of books today. Duty by Secretary Robert Gates, who was in various positions at the CIA during the 1980s, says that the United States did make mistakes. I'm not denying your.
I'm not saying we didn't make mistakes.
I'm not denying your points.
I'm
not denying your points about what Pakistan did, but the United States made severe mistakes. We didn't have to accept I think Ghost Wars, which was also mentioned. I'll pump another book here, lays out that we didn't have to work with the ISI the way we did and defer the judgments on cooperating with the 7 groups. And it was not just the United States that worked with the ISI in this and played a major role in funding these groups. It was also Saudi Arabia and it was also China. All of us, all of those countries made some of those same mistakes. One thing the United States did do that I thought that I believe was a mistake then, and we are continuing paying for, is we gave large amounts of money and large amounts of arms to actors who actually are continuing to use that money that we gave them then. And I'm talking about huge amounts of money. They're continuing to use those arms. I was in the U.S. Embassy. Mike was probably at positions in Afghanistan where you would get incoming rounds, and if you picked up the dud ones, you'd say they were made in China, and you found they were made in China in the 1980s, paid for by the American taxpayers, and used against us. So the United States has made a lot of mistakes. I'm not denying that Pakistan has made mistakes, but I think particularly here in the United States, and particularly someone who's been involved in policy relating to this area, it's important to recognize that we've made mistakes. But I'll go back to the earlier point. Just because Pakistan has made mistakes, just because Pakistan has this really deeply embedded strategic culture that Dr. Fair lays out so much, in my view, does not mean that we should take aim at either the country or individuals. We should look to find ways to advance U.S. interest in ways that have some chance of being successful, aren't guaranteed to be failures. And I think that by reading Dr. Fair's book, we can actually be better prepared to do that.
David, my point is not that the U.S. didn't make mistakes. Those mistakes are incredibly well documented. Even the most foolish of Americans in the most remotest part of the United States have some idea that working with the ISI and the Saudis to basically back the Mujahideen was a really bad idea. My point is a little bit different. I'm not taking aim at our mistakes. I embrace our mistakes. I criticize our government ad nauseum. I'm taking aim at these fictions that this gentleman articulated, because he's not the only one that articulates them. The belief that we created the Mujahideen, the belief that Pakistan had no Muj policy before we came in with our evil designs, this idea of the plebiscite, that Pakistan was used and then cast away, as opposed to Pakistan brought us into their pre-existing Afghan policy, the complete misreading of proliferation and non-proliferation in the Pressler Amendment. I'm taking aim at that mythology. I accept everything that you said about our policy.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but in terms of balance of blame, I think
this isn't about blame. It's about making sure that that Pakistan is not entitled to its own facts, and it has created its own facts.
Again, I believe
I think we've established there are definitely fictions out there, and we also all agree that the U.S. made a fundamental foreign policy error in abandoning the region. and that's Afghanistan, not just Pakistan, but Afghanistan, after the Soviets left. I think we have come to agreement on that, and I'd like to give an opportunity for another question. Okay, Steve Cohen. But can you wait for the, yeah, there you go, Mike.
Yeah, I'll be brief. When I read Chris's book for the publisher in manuscript, I'd also read 2 other books on the Pakistan Army in manuscript, and all 3 are superb. T.V. Paul did a book, Akhil Shah did a book on Chris's book, and they're all different, but they're all essential reading for those of you who want to know the Pakistan military. And Chris's is particularly good because it does what I did in '85, that is, it looks at what the Pakistanis themselves have taught their own people. And I think her account is absolutely accurate. Secondly, I dealt with Pakistan in the Reagan administration. I worked for George Bush, for George Shultz. And he once told me about Pakistan. That time the issue was Pakistan's nuclear program that they did not have, in which we tried to stop. And this was a fiction that we went along with. So he said to me, and Zal was with me, he said, get me a policy. So, and then he said, hope is not a policy. So we said, we hope we'll do this, and we'll do this. He said, hope is not a policy, get me a policy. So we got him a policy, and it was rejected, but that's another issue. We essentially traded off the Pakistan nuclear program for defeating the Soviets in Afghanistan, which was, in retrospect, probably a good trade, but who knows. Thirdly, I'd like to look ahead and really look at future policy options. I agree with Chris, I would go further, that our aid should be conditional. I testified before Congress in the 2000s, something early. It should be this, that we should not have a relationship based on trust. It should not be a transactional relationship. It should be a transactional relationship. Should not be a relationship based on trust. They do this, they get this. We do this, they get that. So, but looking ahead, who else is interested in Pakistan going down the wrong road? And I agree with David that it's not necessarily doomed to failure, and because failure would be catastrophic. 2 countries are really concerned about Pakistan, maybe 3. One is India, of course. I think Indian policy has shifted towards Pakistan. They use us now to influence our policy on Pakistan, which is a good thing, because the Pakistanis have always used us to influence our policy towards India. So in a sense, we're between them, and we should take advantage of it. The other country, a lot of indications of this, is China. Chinese are really concerned about what's happening to Chinese citizens and Chinese investments in coming out of Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's a huge opportunity for the U.S. to at least talk to the Chinese, not about democratizing Pakistan, but at least stabilizing and normalizing Pakistan. And since the Chinese have a special influence with the PLA, I think that's an opportunity for us we should take. And looking ahead, our policy should be addressed working with the Indians and with the Chinese, because they share this common interest with us to have a normal Pakistan. If we don't have a normal Pakistan, the trajectory is a downward slope. It's going to collapse in some awful way. It's going to be Yugoslavia with nuclear weapons, and we don't want to see that happen.
Thank you. I think there was another question right directly behind Steve. And this gentleman right here. You, yes, in the red tie. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Feroz from Brandeis University.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you all for doing such a great job for that region, especially Afghanistan. My question is from Professor Christine. Obviously, I haven't read the book, and I don't know whether you have mentioned this in your book or not. Do you think the disputed line, Durand line, is also one of the reasons behind the insurgency that Pakistan is involved in Afghanistan?
Yeah, this is actually pretty straightforward. So this is in the same way that I think the Pakistanis' position on Kashmir is not tenable. I think the Afghans have made themselves, they've dug their own grave over being recalcitrant over the Durand line. There's no international legal point of view that supports Afghanistan's claims. Pakistan was a legitimate successor of the Raj. It inherited the commitments that the Raj made, and of course that was a commitment made by Abdur Rahman, a sovereign. Now, there were a lot of other commitments that Abdur Rahman made that if you want to go and talk about in reverse, so let's talk about the Wakhan Corridor. How did Afghanistan get the Wakhan Corridor? That was also foisted upon him by the Russian and British empires, because if there weren't for that little Wakhan Corridor, the 2 empires would be touching. So if you want to get rid of the Durand line, give the Wakhan Corridor back. So, and I think part of the reason why Afghanistan is so problematic for Pakistan, as you know, I take it from your accent, you're Afghan. Afghanistan Shama. The only country that rejected Pakistan's entry into the UN, of course, was Afghanistan. And remember that in the Northwest Frontier Province, many of the people there didn't want to join Pakistan from the beginning. They supported the Indian Congress. It took Jinnah a lot of political capital to get them to sign on to the project of Pakistan. And so what Afghanistan, and of course remember in the 1950s, Afghan troops invaded Pakistan. So whereas the Pakistanis inherited this sense of strategic culture that all bad things come from Afghanistan, they also inherited the idea of managing Afghanistan through moving back and forth between the closed border policy and the forward policy. And as time proceeded, the Soviet threat, of course, was real, but then when the Soviets and the Indians signed the Friendship Treaty, and of course it's Afghanistan, so basically you had this alignment, right? You had Pakistan, Iran, and the United States during much of the Cold War, and you had Russia, Afghanistan, and India. So many of the things that Afghanistan has done has actually been very provocative. Let's talk about, I understand why Afghanistan likes letting the Indians do provocative things like build schools on the border of Bajour and Kunar, or build the southern part of the Ring Road, because the Afghans love using India to poke an eye in the Pakistanis. But is this responsible statesmanship, right? Because we will one day leave the region, and you're stuck living with Pakistan. So I think one of the most important things that an Afghan leader should do is basically get out of the Durand Line provocation. It's going to be very difficult for anyone to do that, but I actually don't think most Afghans know or care. So, but if Afghanistan wants to keep Pakistan as a perennial enemy, just keep poking the Durand Line. That's the quickest way to ensure that.
Kokab, right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Kokab Fashiri. I'd like to ask something that Christine mentioned in her opening remarks and a question for the panel. You said, I mean, the cover of your book looks really interesting. You said Oxford University Press said Pakistan Army may have some objections. So did they give you any details what they could object to? And then towards the end of your remarks, you said something about game changer because of the composition of different provinces. So I'd like to elaborate on the very last point that you made in your opening remarks. And for the panel, why do you think it took Pakistan so long in launching the operation that it has recently launched, especially when everybody is saying that almost 90% of those they intended to kill have left the area? Thank you.
So yeah, actually I have the emails wherein OUP explained why they can't use the cover. They thought that the cover mocked the Pakistan Army and that this would be...
In what way?
It did mock the Pakistan Army. That's why I'm a big fan of this artist, Saira Wasim, because her work speaks very squarely to civil-military relations. It speaks squarely to, I mean, the cover at one level says, look, we've got nuclear weapons, but the Army has impoverished our country. These fellows are wearing flip-flops. It's a carousel, same generals moving around, same general, different angle. So the cover does mock the position that the Pakistan Army assumes. So A, they were right. I thought their very bold request to change maps, because the maps in the book don't reflect Pakistan's fantasies of maps, I thought that was really outrageous. And it kind of made the point that I make, that even Pakistan's press is a very vibrant press, but it's a very self-censoring press. What was your second question? The provinces. Oh, you missed. I was talking very quickly, and I talk quickly anyway. Wasn't the changing composition of the provinces? The Pakistan Army, to its credit, understands that much of the problems, not civil military, but many of its reputational problems stem from the fact that the Pak Army, like most armies, draw from the population that draws from the population. And Pakistan's population is a plurality Punjabis, a majority if you include Saraiki speakers. So it's going to be natural that there's going to be more Punjabis than not. But because it's seen as a Punjabi Pashtun condominium, and because the Army runs the show, because the Army has a whole suite of perquisites, they're not available to everyone else, for the Pakistan Army, more so than other armies, it's important that these perquisites at least appear to be available to everyone. Now, they have a problem, like in our military, we are generally demand, we're generally supply constrained, and that there are fewer soldiers and most times than we actually have billets for them, so we get to pick and choose. The Pakistan Army, there is much more supply of potential officers than there is demand. So they can always pick and choose the best, but chances are they're going to get Punjabis because Punjabis have more education, the higher educational standards. And so what the Army has to do, they have to go out of their way to relax standards to get people in Balochistan and Sindh who don't meet the educational requirements by a very significant difference. They have to build cantonments, they have to build cadet academies, they have to build this infrastructure to create a desire to join the military, but also to get people who have the human capital requirements to do this. So what I'm saying is, and these results have actually paid off. Ayub tried to do this when he first came in with East Pakistan. He understood that this was a problem. So to the Pakistan Army's credit, they've been using manpower personnel policies very effectively. But things are free riders, right? Because the districts into which they're expanding their recruitment don't share all the same jihad-mongering policies of some of the core districts in the Punjab. So if they're going to continue trying to diversify the military, they're going to be bringing in officers from areas that really have different values. Militaries, by definition, tend to put everyone through the sausage maker and squeeze out a sausage. So it may be that those that are sort of outliers will not get promoted. Maybe they'll attrit. We don't know. But that's why I said, so for me, one of the most interesting sources of change comes from the Army itself as a consequence of it trying to be more representative, which I think we would agree is an admirable goal. But it has this free riding issue, these other changes.
The third question about why did the Pak Army take so long to launch the current operation in North Waziristan?
I can only tell you what I've heard from Pakistani military officers, both when I was in government and after I left. I can tell you first what they said, which is that they needed sufficient political backing from Pakistani society broadly to do so, and they pointed to the support that they felt they had before the SWAT offensive made that possible, and in their view made that reasonably successful. And so if you follow that line of reasoning, then it would be because of they clearly moved so quickly because they had all the logistical and other things in place. So they were prepared to do it, but they needed a trigger, and that trigger was quite possibly the attacks on the Karachi airport that perhaps played a motivating role in Pakistani society writ large, that some of the attacks on girls and other things that happened in SWAT that helped mobilize that opinion there. So again, that's what what I've heard from the Pakistani military, and that's one plausible explanation. Another is that they were not prepared to do so until they had taken steps to ensure that those parts of the syndicate of extremist groups that they find useful and support in various ways had the opportunity to rearrange themselves, move places, be out of the line of fire so that they could go after the ones that they had decided were the greatest threat to them. That's another explanation as well. I just don't have enough information to know whether that's how much to back that up, but that's another explanation. But in the end, to me, the offensive, that's what they've done so far, from what I've read and heard militarily, at least has begun in a way that gives a possibility that it will continue in a way that allows Pakistan to do what it has to do, is to actually exert sovereignty over its own territory. Until the Pakistani military really has sovereignty over its own territory, then it's not in a position to do things like raise sovereignty concerns about attacks by so-called drones, because those won't be needed if Pakistan actually controls those areas, because then the Pakistani government will be fully responsible for that.
Great.
And so that lack of sovereignty is an area that we'll have to see whether they actually achieve that or not.
Thank you so much, and we're going to have to wrap it up. There's another program in this room. I'm sorry for continued questions. We can take it in the hall and continue the discussion, but thank you so much for coming. And let's give a big round of applause for Chris and the others.